In September of 2022, many of us experienced the death of a reigning British monarch for the first time. Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years and died at the ripe old age of 96. While many mourned her death, it's safe to say that it was not entirely unexpected. Unlike her father, George VI, whose sudden passing left the British Empire stunned when he died of a coronary thrombosis, a blood clot in his sleep, at just 56 years old. But it was Elizabeth's grandfather, George V, the monarch whom the young Queen-to-be lovingly called Grandpa England, whose death shocked the world, not just at the time of his passing, but 50 years later, when it was revealed that a royal physician may have committed murder. King George V's reign began on May 6, 1910, when his father, King Edward VII, passed away following a somewhat brief 9-year rule. His early reign was marked by the global upheaval of the First World War, the Easter Rising in Dublin, and the establishment of the Irish Republic. The king was not known for his intellect or education, having spent his early adulthood not in private schools or among royal tutors, but at sea, serving in the Royal Navy. Compared to the lavish reigns of many of his predecessors, George lived simply. He gained a reputation for steadfast commitment to duty, famously refusing to offer asylum to his Romanov cousin Nicholas II after the Russian Revolution. And so determined was he to distance himself from his German heritage during World War I that he changed the royal family's name to Windsor, marking the end of the House of Hanover. By the end of World War I, George was one of the few European monarchs who had not fallen to revolution or war. In 1926, George V experienced the first and only general strike to take place in Britain when 1.5 million workers walked out in solidarity with British miners who had seen their pay slashed from £6 to less than £4 over 7 years. When another 13% wage reduction was announced, the Trade Union Congress called a general strike that brought many vital industries to a grinding halt, leading Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to declare a state of emergency. While conservative-controlled newspapers condemned the strikers as revolutionaries, and the Roman Catholic Church declared the labour movement a sin, George sympathised with the workers. He cautioned the government against inflammatory action, saying, "Try living on their wages before you judge them." 9 days after the strikes began, the Trade Union Congress called off the strike without a single concession to the miners' case. Baldwin's Parliament passed the Trades Disputes Act a year later, which banned sympathy strikes and mass picketing. Miners returned to work, now for less pay and longer hours. The strike had failed spectacularly, but George emerged as a monarch with a conscience. Later that same year, he hosted an imperial conference in London, which resulted in the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. The declaration acknowledged the increasing political and diplomatic independence of the British dominions. It pronounced them equal in status and no way subordinate one to another in any aspect of their domestic or external affairs. The Declaration set the stage for the Statute of Westminster 1931, a parliamentary act that granted the Dominions full legal autonomy. George wanted the laws of royal succession to be exempt from the statute, but ultimately it was decided that this would be contrary to the promised equality of the Balfour Declaration. In his final years on the throne, he ushered in a new national government aimed at restoring confidence during the early years of the Great Depression. Eager to do his share, George offered to reduce the civil list to help balance the budget. The civil list was an annual grant covering the monarch's expenses, including staff salaries, state visits, and public engagements. In 1931, he forewent £50,000 in a show of solidarity and as a practical way to reduce the government's budget. It was a decision that further cemented the shift in the monarchy to more closely align itself with the middle class. In 1932, George delivered the first annual royal Christmas speech on the radio, despite his hesitation about the innovative form of communication. His holiday message, scripted by Rudyard Kipling, was delivered from Sandringham House to massive public praise. The king expected the broadcast to be a one-off, but was persuaded to make it an annual event when presented with letters from citizens across the Commonwealth expressing their delight at welcoming the monarch into their homes on Christmas Day. Having seen his nation through one world war, George V was disturbed by the growing power of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party in Germany. In 1934, he warned the German ambassador that Germany was now the peril of the world and that another war was certain within 10 years if the country continued at its present rate. He also warned Eric Phipps, the British ambassador in Berlin, to be wary of the Nazis. 1935 saw him celebrate his Silver Jubilee, marking 25 years of his reign. As he listened to the cheers and applause of the crowd gathered, he remarked, "I cannot understand it. After all, I am only a very ordinary sort of fellow," which was, of course, precisely what endeared many Britons to him. But the adoration did not extend to some within the palace. George's relationship with his eldest son and heir apparent Edward deteriorated in the final years of his reign. The two were known to loathe each other mutually. George was displeased and disappointed with Edward's lifestyle, which included many affairs with married women. In 1935, he said of Edward, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. Conversely, George doted on his second son, Albert, and his oldest granddaughter, Elizabeth. In the months before his death, he wrote, "I pray to God my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." The king had long been concerned about succession, having been close to death several times throughout his reign. In a troop review during the war, his horse fell on top of him, crushing his pelvis and leaving him with lifelong chronic pain. He also suffered from chronic bronchitis, made worse by his heavy smoking habit. In 1928, George was diagnosed with septicemia, a life-threatening bacterial infection. Edward took over most of the king's duties for nearly 2 years, and the illness continued to impact George for the rest of his life. Of course, the king had access to the best medical care in the world and was looked after by a team of prestigious medical professionals. Among their ranks was Bertrand Dawson. Dawson joined the royal household in 1907 and was promoted to physician extraordinary by George V when he became the reigning monarch in 1910. During the war, Dawson was dispatched to France as a consulting physician to the British armies. While at the Western Front, he noticed the worrying prevalence of disease in the soldiers' toes, prompting some of the first research on the condition that would come to be known as trench foot. Following the war, he was commissioned to write a report on future systemic health care, which was used decades later during debates about the implementation of the National Health Service. In 1920, Dawson was raised to the peerage as Baron Dawson of Penn, becoming the first active medical consultant to receive the honour. He spoke frequently at the House of Lords on topics like birth control, municipal hospitals, and insanity as a ground for divorce. 6 years later, he was appointed Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath and was later appointed to the Privy Council, a former group of advisors to the king. He also held office as both the President of the Royal Society of Medicine and the Royal College of Physicians. He was, by all measures, one of the most experienced and respected physicians in Britain. So when King George fell ill on the evening of January 15th, 1936, it was naturally Bertrand Dawson whom Queen Mary called for. George had been struggling with the grief of the death of his favourite sister, Victoria, the month before, and his continued health problems left him weakened and depressed. He retired to his bedroom at Sandringham House, complaining of a cold, and never emerged alive again. The 71-year-old monarch slipped in and out of consciousness over the next 4 days, but was roused for a 10-minute meeting with his Privy Council on January the 20th. By 9:25 that evening, Dawson issued a bulletin that stated the king's life is moving peacefully towards its close. In the days after his death, it would be reported that the king's final words were, "How is the empire?" A touching last worry for a monarch on his deathbed. For decades, the world believed the king had slipped peacefully into death just before midnight, surrounded by his loved ones. But in 1986, Dawson's private notes were made public for the first time, and they revealed a far different story of King George V's final hours. According to his notes, he had examined George after dinner and asked his nurse to administer a small dose of morphine to help the king sleep. It was then, as a needle was forced through his skin, that George muttered his actual last words, "God damn you." Later that evening, the Archbishop of Canterbury prayed at his bedside. After he left, Dawson prepared a vial of morphine and cocaine. Unbeknownst to the Queen, the physician had been slowly increasing the doses of morphine and had begun lacing the concoction with cocaine to speed up the king's death. At 11 o'clock, Dawson administered the injection to George's jugular vein. Queen Mary and the king's children were then invited into the room and told that the end was near. Mary held George's hand, and at 11:55 p.m. on January the 20th, 1936, the king was declared dead. The timing was also orchestrated by Dawson, who wanted to ensure that the news was announced in the morning edition of the papers rather than the evening editions. In his notes, he justified his actions as affording the king the dignity and serenity he deserved. Queen Mary and Edward had told Dawson that they did not want the king's life needlessly prolonged, but had not, as far as history knows, consented to euthanasia. Nor is there any record of the king himself being consulted. If anything, George's final words reflect a man who did not consent to his treatment. 10 months after George's death, Dawson spoke at a debate about the legalization of euthanasia at the House of Lords. While he condemned the proposed bill, he did believe that such a mission of mercy should be left up to individual physicians rather than government regulators. When his diaries were publicized, they were not met by a new generation that embraced the physician's decision as he had imagined. Dawson believed that he was an advanced mind, someone who appreciated the kindness that euthanasia afforded patients with terminal illnesses. But he had miscalculated in the most meaningful way. He had failed to consider what the patient that lay before him wanted. He had violated the first part of the Hippocratic Oath, to do no harm. In failing to obtain consent from the patient or their next of kin, Dawson had inflicted harm that echoed across decades. And according to British law in 1936 and today, what he did was nothing short of murder. In 1986, Queen Elizabeth II was 60 years old. She no longer resembled the little Lilibet her grandpa England was often found crawling around with on all fours. It is unknown how she reacted to the news that her beloved grandfather had been killed by a trusted physician, a physician who continued to treat the royal household during the reign of her father. Buckingham Palace told reporters it happened a long time ago, and all those concerned are now dead. Did Queen Elizabeth II, now over 30 years into her own reign, consider herself unconcerned with her grandfather's death? Was it truly an event so long ago that it no longer mattered to her? Or had she, like others, suspected that the strange timing of King George V's death while being treated by a physician who was an outspoken advocate for euthanasia was more than sheer coincidence? Perhaps she had even heard the schoolyard rhyme that began circulating while Dawson was still alive. Lord Dawson of Penn killed many men. That's why we sing, God Save the King. What do you think about the case? Was it murder? Or was Dawson simply helping to cut short George's suffering? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story that will make you say, well, I never.